Case 1. Danielle Houchins, Montana, 1996. On the morning of September 17, 1996, 15-year-old Danielle Houchins left her home in Missoula, Montana, wearing her favorite jacket. She was a sophomore. She liked music and had a wide circle of friends who described her as the kind of girl who remembered everyone's birthday. Her mother said she talked constantly, on the phone, at dinner, in the car, filling whatever room she was in with words. She didn't come home from school that afternoon. Her body was discovered days later. She had been sexually assaulted and murdered. The case stunned the Missoula community. She was 15 years old. She had done nothing wrong. And for 28 years, no one was charged. Investigators at the time collected biological evidence from the crime scene. But the DNA technology of 1996 wasn't what it is today. The sample was preserved, the case remained open, and year after year the file grew thicker with dead ends. What investigators always had was the biology. What they didn't have, until 2024, was the match. Genetic genealogy changed that. Using Danielle's preserved evidence, forensic genealogists built a family tree from the DNA outward, the same technique used to find the Golden State Killer. The branches narrowed, the relatives thinned. The tree pointed to a single man, Paul Hutchinson, a local resident who had lived in the Missoula area for decades. Detectives reached out to Hutchinson to request a voluntary DNA sample for elimination purposes. Within 24 hours of that contact, Paul Hutchinson was dead. He took his own life. He never faced trial. He never sat across from Danielle's family in a courtroom. But his death confirmed what the genealogy had already told investigators. The DNA didn't lead them to an innocent man. Danielle Houchins was 15 years old. She had been waiting 28 years for someone to say her name in the context of justice. In 2024, someone finally did. How many families are still waiting for that envelope? Case 2. Melanie White, Las Vegas, 1994. On a stretch of desert highway near Lake Mead, Nevada, in the summer of 1994, a woman named Melanie White was found murdered. She was in her 30s. She had a life in Las Vegas that was complicated by circumstances that made her, in the eyes of investigators at the time, a lower priority case. Her murder was documented, her evidence was collected. And then, for nearly 30 years, the case moved at the speed of bureaucracy, which is to say, it barely moved at all. The biological evidence from Melanie's case entered the genealogy pipeline in 2023. Investigators submitted the DNA profile to a public genealogy database and waited. The algorithm searched. The matches came back. The tree that emerged pointed to a man named Arthur Lavery. Investigators located Lavery and began building a corroborating case. They cross-referenced records, documented his presence in Las Vegas during the relevant period, and assembled what they needed for a warrant. Then they discovered something that stopped the investigation cold. Arthur Lavery had died in 2021, 3 years before investigators identified him, 3 years before Melanie White's family received any answer. He died having never been charged, having never been questioned about her murder, having lived the entirety of his natural life without consequence. There will be no trial. There will be no sentencing. There will be no moment where a judge looks him in the eye and says what he did. What Melanie White's family received in 2024 was not justice. It was something smaller and harder, a name, an explanation, the knowledge that the right man had been identified. Whether that is enough is not a question anyone can answer for them. Was that justice, or just the closest thing to it that Melanie White would ever get? Case 3. Kathy Hall, Chicago, 1979. On a winter night in Chicago in 1979, Kathy Hall was murdered. She was 23 years old. She was a young woman building a life in one of the country's largest cities, and she was killed before she had the chance to see what that life would become. Her case was linked early on to a man named Bruce Lindell, a Chicago area killer who died in 1981 before he could be tried for the full extent of his crimes. Investigators believed Lindell was responsible for Kathy's murder, but belief and proof are two different things, and for 45 years there wasn't enough of the latter. The problem was biological evidence so degraded by time that standard DNA analysis couldn't touch it. The sample existed. It simply wasn't workable, not by the technology of 1979, not by the technology of 1999, not by the technology of 2010. In 2024, that changed. Forensic scientists applied a technique known as MVAC, microvacuum and collection, a method that essentially performs a microscopic sweep of a surface or sample, recovering biological material at quantities so small they register in the parts per trillion range. Material that had been invisible to every previous analysis was suddenly visible. The recovered DNA matched Bruce Lindell. He was already dead. He had been dead for 43 years, but the confirmation that investigators had been right, that the man they suspected had in fact killed Kathy Howell, closed a chapter that her family had been unable to close for nearly half a century. The MVAC technique is not widely known outside forensic circles. Its application to cold cases from the 1970s and 1980s is still new. But the Kathy Hall case is now cited as proof of concept. Samples that were declared scientifically exhausted are not necessarily exhausted. They simply needed to wait for the right tool. The tool arrived 45 years late. What other cases are sitting in evidence rooms right now, waiting for a technology that doesn't exist yet? Case 4. Gayla McNeil, 1983. In 1983, Gayla McNeil was murdered. The details of where she lived and how she died are less important for a moment than this. She was a real woman with a real family, and for 40 years, 4 full decades, no one was held accountable for what happened to her. 40 years is a long time to wait. Children become adults, parents grow old and die. Nieces and nephews reach middle age carrying a grief they inherited, grieving a woman some of them never got the chance to know. The DNA profile from Gayla's case had been in law enforcement databases for years. It returned no hits. The sample sat as an unidentified genetic fingerprint, present, preserved, matchless. In 2024, it found its match. James Henderson was arrested 40 years after Gayla McNeil's murder. Law enforcement did not announce which specific genealogy method produced the identification, but the result was unambiguous. Henderson's DNA matched what investigators had been holding since 1983. He was taken into custody. 40 years. The math of that is staggering when you sit with it. Whatever Henderson's life had been since 1983, wherever he lived, whoever he became, he had carried this with him. And on the day investigators came to his door, that weight became visible to everyone else. Gayla McNeil deserved this decades ago. Her family deserved this decades ago. The arrest came in 2024. It came late, but it came. Does 40 years change what justice means? Or does justice mean exactly the same thing, no matter when it arrives? Case 5. Mary Schlaese, Wisconsin, 1974. On February 15, 1974, the body of Mary Schlaese was found on the roadside in Wisconsin. She was 25 years old. She had been hitchhiking. She was never seen alive again after accepting a ride near Chicago, and her body turned up hours later in a state she hadn't planned to be in, on a road that led nowhere she had intended to go. The case went cold within years. Mary Schlaese became a name in a filing cabinet, a photograph on a shelf. A birthday her family observed without her, year after year, for 50 years. The biological evidence from her case was submitted to genealogy analysis in the early 2020s. The tree that emerged pointed to a man named John K. Miller. Investigators didn't announce the identification publicly before they were ready. They built their corroborating evidence. They documented the connection. And when they were certain, they made contact. John K. Miller did not fight it. He confessed. He was charged with first-degree intentional homicide. In a plea hearing, he entered a no-contest plea. In 2025, a Wisconsin judge sentenced him to life in prison. He was elderly by the time he stood in that courtroom. The years between 1974 and his sentencing had been his to live freely. Mary Schlase did not get those years. What her family said at sentencing has not been widely reported. But the fact that they were there, that they lived to see it, is something. Mary Schlase was 25 years old in 1974. It took 51 years for a courtroom to say what happened to her. 51 years. How do you measure what was lost in between? For decades, the file sat where so many cold cases sit, not forgotten, but waiting. Every few years, someone reopened it. New investigators inherited old reports. New technology examined old evidence. The people working the case changed. The questions did not. Who picked Mary Schlase up that day? Who drove her away from the route she intended to travel? Who left her dead on a rural Wisconsin road and then continued living as if nothing had happened? The answers were there, somewhere, hidden inside evidence collected in 1974 by investigators who could not have imagined the tools that would exist 50 years later. Near the scene, investigators recovered a stocking cap. Human hairs were found on it. At the time, there was no practical way to identify who those hairs belonged to. The evidence was catalogued, stored, and preserved. That decision would matter more than anyone knew, because while witnesses aged, memories faded, and leads disappeared, the evidence remained. Silent, waiting. Years turned into decades. The world changed. Computers became smaller. Databases became larger. DNA science advanced from something experimental into one of the most powerful investigative tools ever developed. Then came investigative genetic genealogy. Instead of searching for a direct match, investigators could search for relatives. A distant cousin, a shared ancestor, a branch of a family tree. One connection leading to another until a suspect emerged from among thousands of names. The technology did not solve the case overnight. It simply gave investigators a direction, and for the first time in decades, they had one. The genetic trail eventually pointed toward John K. Miller. Even then, detectives moved carefully. A family tree is not proof. A DNA lead is not a conviction. Investigators retraced decades-old facts. They verified relationships. They reviewed reports. They assembled every piece of evidence they could find. Only when they were confident did they approach Miller. By then, he was in his 80s. More than half a century had passed since Mary Schlase died. When confronted, investigators say Miller admitted what happened. According to court records, he told them he picked Mary up while she was hitchhiking. At some point, he asked her for sex. She refused. What happened next ended her life. He stabbed her repeatedly. Then he left her body in the snow and drove away. The simplicity of that confession is almost disturbing. No elaborate motive, no complicated conspiracy. Just a young woman trying to reach an art show, and a man who decided her answer was not acceptable. For 50 years, her family carried the uncertainty, not knowing who, not knowing why, not knowing whether justice would ever arrive. The suspect, meanwhile, lived an entire lifetime. He watched decades pass. He saw new presidents elected, new technologies invented, entire generations born and raised. He experienced birthdays that Mary never would. He grew old. Mary Schlase did not. She remained 25 forever. That contrast sat at the center of the courtroom when sentencing finally arrived. The victim frozen in time, the killer aged by it. And yet, time became the very thing that solved the case. Because the evidence survived, the investigators persisted, the science improved, and the truth eventually caught up. At sentencing, the court imposed life imprisonment. For some, that sentence felt symbolic. After all, Miller had already lived most of his life. But the sentence was never about restoring what was taken. Nothing could do that. No verdict can return a daughter. No prison sentence can recreate 51 lost years. No courtroom can rewind history. Justice in cold cases is often incomplete. It arrives too late to change the past, but it can establish the truth. And truth matters. It matters to families who spent decades wondering. It matters to investigators who refuse to quit. It matters because every unsolved murder leaves behind a question that never stops asking itself, what happened? In Mary Schlase's case, that question finally received an answer. The file was closed. The mystery ended. The uncertainty that had lasted more than half a century finally broke. Mary Schlase was not remembered because she was murdered. She was remembered because she lived. She was an artist, a University of Minnesota graduate, a young woman with plans beyond the winter of 1974, someone who expected tomorrow to arrive, someone whose future was larger than the road she was traveling that day. For decades, the story was about a cold case, a mystery, an unsolved homicide. Now it is also a story about persistence, about evidence preserved long enough for science to catch up, about investigators who refused to stop looking, and about a family that lived long enough to see the truth acknowledged in a court of law. 51 years, 18,600 days, an entire lifetime. That is how long it took for justice to arrive. Not perfect justice, not complete justice, but enough for a courtroom to finally say what happened, enough for a killer to hear a sentence, enough for a family to stop waiting. Mary Schlase was 25 years old when her life ended on a Wisconsin roadside. More than half a century later, the world finally learned the name of the man responsible. And after 51 years of silence, the case that once seemed destined to remain unsolved finally had an ending. Case 6, Caroline Bolin, Texas, 1988. Caroline Bolin was 26 years old when she was murdered inside her home in Silsbee, Texas. On July 28, 1988, police were dispatched to her residence after concern for her welfare. When officers arrived, they discovered a brutal crime scene. Caroline had been sexually assaulted and killed by an unknown attacker. Her 6-year-old son was still inside the home. The person responsible had vanished. From the beginning, investigators had something many cold cases never get. DNA biological evidence had been left behind. Detectives knew the killer had left a trace of himself at the scene. The problem was that knowing someone exists and knowing who they are two very different things. The DNA profile was developed and entered into CODIS, the National DNA Database. No match. Investigators ran the search again. Still no match. Years passed. Nothing. The profile remained in the system, attached to an unsolved murder, waiting for a name that never appeared. That absence became a clue of its own. Whoever killed Caroline Bolin had either never been required to provide DNA to law enforcement or had somehow avoided entering the system altogether. Meanwhile, Caroline's family waited. The case never officially closed. Leads were revisited. Evidence was reviewed. Detectives changed. The questions remained. Who entered Caroline Bolin's home that night? Who assaulted her? Who killed her? And how could someone commit a crime like that and disappear for decades? In 2019, investigators reopened the case with fresh eyes. Advances in forensic science had transformed what was possible. Evidence that had once been exhausted could now be examined using techniques that did not exist when the murder occurred. The biological evidence was sent for additional analysis. A DNA profile was successfully developed. Again, there was no Codis match. But investigators now had another option. Forensic genetic genealogy, the same investigative method that helped identify the suspect in the Golden State Killer case. Instead of looking for the suspect directly, investigators looked for relatives. A distant cousin, a shared ancestor, a branch of a family tree. Every DNA match became a clue. Every clue became another branch. Every branch moved investigators closer to a name. The process was painstaking. Thousands of records, birth certificates, marriage records, census documents, obituaries, family connections stretching across generations. Slowly, a picture emerged, and eventually that picture pointed toward one man, Alan Wayne Mosley. Investigators began digging deeper. What they found was troubling. Mosley had lived on a street adjacent to Caroline Boland's home at the time of the murder. Investigators also learned that he had previously been on court-ordered supervision in connection with a rape case involving the stranger abduction of a minor. Suddenly, the decades-old case looked very different. The DNA evidence had produced a suspect. Now detectives needed to determine whether the rest of the evidence supported what the science was suggesting. According to investigators, it did. Witness statements from 1988 described a man matching Mosley's appearance, leaving the area around the time of the crime. Investigators also determined that Mosley relocated away from the area after the murder. Piece by piece, the case began coming together. Not because of a confession, not because a witness suddenly remembered, because science had finally become capable of answering a question that investigators in 1988 could not. The irony is that the answer arrived too late for a trial. Alan Wayne Mosley died by suicide in Tulsa, Oklahoma, in 2006, 20 years before investigators publicly identified him. That means there will be no arrest, no arraignment, no jury selection, no courtroom testimony, no verdict. The legal system will never have the opportunity to determine guilt or innocence in a criminal trial. For many families, justice means a conviction. For others, justice becomes something simpler, an answer, a name, the end of uncertainty. For nearly 4 decades, Caroline Boland's murder existed as an unanswered question. Today, it exists as a solved case. Not because every question has been answered, but because investigators finally know who the evidence was pointing toward all along. The DNA never forgot. It sat quietly inside the case file for decades, waiting. Technology changed, methods improved, investigators persisted, and eventually the biology left behind in 1988 spoke for itself. A name was attached to the evidence. A face was attached to the name. The anonymous profile inside an unsolved homicide became a person. Alan Wayne Mosley. Caroline Boland never received the years that followed July 1988. Her family spent decades without answers. The suspect spent those decades living freely. But even after 37 years, the evidence remained. And in the end, it was enough. No trial, no sentence, no prison cell. Just a truth that took nearly 4 decades to uncover. Caroline Boland's case reminds us that a cold case is not the same thing as a forgotten case. Sometimes the evidence is simply waiting for the future to catch up. And when it does, even silence can finally give up a name. Case 7. Bradley Britton, Ontario, Canada. Some cases don't involve murder. That distinction matters, but it doesn't reduce the harm. Sexual assault leaves damage that lasts decades. Lives altered, trust broken, safety lost permanently. And when a perpetrator is never identified, that harm compounds. Every year that passes without an arrest is another year the survivor lives with the knowledge that the person who hurt them is still free. In Ontario, Canada, a series of sexual assaults committed over a span of more than 35 years remained unsolved for most of that time. The cases were connected by biology, investigators had DNA evidence, but no match existed in Canadian criminal databases. The decision was made to submit the unknown profile to investigative genealogy. The trees built from the DNA pointed to Bradley Britton. When investigators matched Britton's DNA to the evidence from the assaults, the scope of what they were looking at became clear. 35-plus years of offending, multiple victims, a pattern that had continued, undetected, for longer than some of his victims had been alive. In 2025, Bradley Britton was sentenced. The sentence reflected the severity and duration of his crimes. The survivors who had lived for decades without an answer, without a name, without a face, without the ability to say this person did this to me and they were caught, finally had all three. Investigative genealogy is not legally recognized in all jurisdictions. The admissibility of evidence built through public genealogy databases varies by country and by case. Canada's successful prosecution of Bradley Britton is a data point that advocates for expanding these methods will cite for years, 35 years. And the question that lingers, how many more were there? For decades, the DNA existed without a name. Investigators knew the same person was connected to multiple assaults. They knew the offender had left biological evidence behind. They knew he was real. What they didn't know was who he was. The assaults stretched across years, then decades. Victims moved, families changed, careers began and ended. Entire chapters of life unfolded while the person responsible remained unidentified. The survivors carried memories that never completely disappeared. Some tried not to think about what happened. Others followed every development in the case. Some may have believed the day would never come. No witness identified him. No database matched him. No arrest came. The DNA sat inside evidence lockers while technology slowly caught up to the questions investigators were asking. Year after year, the profile remained anonymous, a biological signature without a name attached to it. Then forensic genetic genealogy changed everything. Instead of asking whether the offender was already in a criminal database, investigators asked a different question. Who was he related to? The answer wasn't immediate. Distant relatives appeared first, third cousins, fourth cousins, family branches spreading across generations. Genealogists began building family trees. Thousands of records were examined, birth records, marriage records, obituaries, census documents. Every connection mattered. Slowly, a pattern emerged. Then a candidate emerged, Bradley Britton, the name that investigators had been searching for all along. Once detectives focused on Britton, the investigation accelerated. Additional evidence was gathered. DNA comparisons were conducted. The science pointed in the same direction. The unknown offender was no longer unknown. After more than 3 decades, the mystery began to collapse. What had once been an unsolved case became a named suspect. What had once been an anonymous DNA profile became a person standing in the real world. A face, a history, a life, and eventually, accountability. For investigators, cases like this are reminders that evidence can outlast silence. Witness memories fade, people relocate, records disappear, but DNA remains, waiting, preserved, patient. A biological time capsule that doesn't care how many years have passed. 35 years is longer than many law enforcement careers, longer than some marriages, longer than some victims had been alive. Yet the evidence remained capable of answering questions that once seemed impossible. By the time Bradley Britton was sentenced, the world was completely different from the one in which the crimes occurred. Technology had changed, society had changed, the justice system had changed, but the evidence had remained the same, waiting for science to catch up. Cases like this raise difficult questions. How many offenders escaped identification because the technology didn't yet exist? How many survivors were told there were no leads when the evidence actually contained the answer all along? And how many cold cases sitting in evidence rooms today already contain the information needed to identify the person responsible? The answer may be more than anyone realizes. For the survivors, however, the larger questions are often less important than the personal one. Who did this? For decades, that question had no answer. Now it does. The sentence itself cannot erase what happened. No prison term can restore lost years. No courtroom proceeding can undo trauma that followed victims for decades. Justice arrived late, but it arrived. And sometimes that matters more than people realize, because uncertainty carries its own weight. Not knowing can become a punishment all its own. Every year without answers becomes another year of wondering, another year of waiting, another year of imagining a face that remains unknown. Then one day the waiting ends. The DNA speaks. The name emerges, and the person who existed only as a shadow inside an evidence file becomes real. Bradley Britton. A name attached to evidence, a face attached to a name, an answer attached to decades of questions. 35 years passed before investigators could say with confidence who was responsible. 35 years before survivors could hear that answer. 35 years before a courtroom could acknowledge what happened. Not every cold case receives that ending. This one did. And somewhere inside evidence rooms across Canada, the United States, and the rest of the world, there are other anonymous DNA profiles waiting for their turn. Other names that have not yet been discovered. Other survivors still waiting for answers. The technology continues to improve. The databases continue to grow. The family trees continue to expand. And with every case solved, the number of places left to hide becomes smaller. 35 years. That is how long the evidence waited. The question now is how many other names are still hidden inside evidence lockers, waiting for science to find them. Case 8, Xenia Williams/Driver's Flat. Jane Doe, Placer, County, California, 2001. In 2001, a set of human remains was discovered in a remote area of Placer County, California, near a location known locally as Driver's Flat. The remains were unidentified. Standard forensic analysis produced a biological profile, age range, ancestry, sex, but no name. The woman was entered into the National Missing Persons Database as a Jane Doe. She received a case number. She received a reference photograph. And then, as happens with unidentified remains when there are no living relatives calling in, she was largely forgotten by the system that was supposed to find out who she was. For 23 years, she had no name. In 2024, a group of students at Ramapo College in New Jersey changed that. Ramapo runs one of the few undergraduate forensic genealogy programs in the United States, a course specifically designed to train students to apply DNA genealogy techniques to real active cold cases in partnership with law enforcement. These are not simulations. These are real Jane Does and John Does. Real unidentified people, real families, somewhere who don't know what happened to someone they lost. The Placer County Jane Doe was assigned to a Ramapo team. The students worked her DNA through the genealogy process, uploading the profile to a public database, identifying distant relatives, building family trees branch by branch, eliminating candidates, narrowing the field. The work is meticulous. It is slow. It is emotionally heavy when you know that at the end of the tree is a real person. The tree pointed to a woman named Xenia Williams. With a name attached, investigators were able to locate records that confirmed the identification. A woman named Xenia Williams had gone missing in 2001. Her family had not known what happened to her. She had been in Placer County. The biology matched the profile. The The timeline fit. Xenia Williams was identified in 2025. Her family was notified. She was given her name back. The students who found her were undergraduates. Some of them were 18, 19, 20 years old. Younger than Xenia Williams had been missing. They sat in a classroom in New Jersey, worked a genealogy tree that ran through several states, and returned a name to a woman who had spent 23 years as a number. No suspect has been publicly identified in connection with her death. The investigation into how she came to be at Driver's Flat remains open. What closed in 2025 was only one question, the question of who she was. That question had an answer. Her name was Xenia Williams. She had a name the whole time. The question was always whether anyone would find it. 8 cases, victims spanning from 1974 to 2001. Suspects who spent between 3 and 50 years living beyond the reach of justice. What changed? DNA didn't suddenly become powerful. The science finally caught up to the evidence. Investigative genetic genealogy allowed detectives to identify suspects through distant relatives. New recovery technologies helped recover DNA from evidence once thought unusable. Universities and genealogy programs brought fresh resources to cases that had sat untouched for decades. Together, those advances changed everything. The result: 8 cases that once seemed unsolvable suddenly had answers. For some families, those answers came with arrests, confessions, and prison sentences. For others, they came too late. The suspects had already died. And for some, the answer wasn't a perpetrator at all. It was simply a name returned to a victim who had spent years as a Jane Doe. No 2 endings looked the same, but they all shared one thing in common. The waiting ended. DNA doesn't decide what justice means. It doesn't undo decades of loss. It doesn't give families back the years they spent without answers. It only answers one question: who? What comes after that belongs to the living, to the families, to the courts, to all of us. These 8 cases are not the end of the story. They are the beginning of a new era, one where evidence collected decades ago can still speak. And somewhere tonight, in an evidence locker waiting to be reopened, another answer may already exist. That's all 8 cases. If you found this story fascinating, subscribe for more deep dives into the cases where science, justice, and time collide.